Today, we're going to be talking about something that unfortunately is, uh, yeah, very American, I will say. And it is the mass killers situation. Of course, there are a lot of folks who are doing mass shootings, especially over the last, 25 years. And, why is it that we in the US have this problem as opposed to other countries that also have guns, for instance, like Switzerland? They don't have mass shootings, at least at the rate that we do. Well, we're going to talk about this with our next guest, who is the author of The Minds of Mass Killers. She is a psychotherapist. Shavaun Scott, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you for having me.
I guess I just want to start off with something. I sort of led with it, which is the United States is just so unique in this, and it's hard to say. You open up the news, will say it's the guns, which I'm sure has something to do with this. Lack of health care. What is it that makes us unique? Is it a bunch of different things? I know that you get into the mindset, but what kind of leads to that?
Yeah, it's really my favorite word, multifactorial, because if it was just one thing, we would have fixed it a long time ago. But yes, these incidents are increasing in frequency, growing more deadly, particularly in the last 5 years, more motivated by hate-based extremism. And we're not going in the right direction. We're going in the wrong direction. So it's really a perfect storm of personality characteristics of the killers, combined with social factors, which are the people in their immediate world, and that includes online connections, which are really important and very powerful. The overall culture. We are a culture that celebrates, if you want to use the term, American Psychological Association talks about toxic masculinity, which is basically a very gun-oriented country, and male power. To be a man is all about domination and violence, and we solve problems in our entertainment and everything else with weapons. And you put all that together with our incredibly easy access to weapons of war, really deadly weapons of war, and then the cultural script that certainly became a very dominant theme after Columbine. But as I say, even in the last 5 years, it's become stronger, that when we have personal problems, mass murder is a solution, which is really bizarre. And we are importing that template to other countries. But yes, certainly nobody has this to the extent the United States does.
Toxic masculinity. How many of these stories, I'm sure there's no accurate breakdown, but, you've heard about young boys in particular going into their school, maybe acting out because a girl did not give them attention, or they felt isolated or not part of the things that happen when you're growing up, right?
Right.
The in crowd, or you asked a girl out and they said no. I mean, that's just normal. But I can't believe how many stories, I'm not saying it's all of them, but how many stories relate to that. But of course, that's not the only thing. I do want to kind of, focus in on the age range, and like the gender. Toxic masculinity is definitely overlapping with this, but who are the majority of these mass killers?
Most school shooters are well, number one, they're male, almost exclusively male. The school shooters would be typically a 15 or 16-year-old boy. College age students are also, we've had a lot of incidents at colleges. Usually they're college age and university students. Their schools and universities are typically insiders. They're somebody that attends or has previously attended the school. And then when you get into workplace shooters, it's usually males in their 30s and 40s. And so you don't get a lot of older mass killers, although you do see that. And particularly with people motivated by racism, people who go into synagogues or mosques, those can be people of any age. But yeah, definitely a man thing. But 90% of all violent crime is committed by men. So I think that's, there's meaning in that. And that would be a whole other topic of what is it about men that makes them more prone to violence, where women, of course, can be aggressive, but we do things in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't know that based on all the Netflix shows that talk about serial killer women. I'm like, what?
Yeah. And then just to address the thing you mentioned about, kids having the normal disappointments of life, there's kind of a cultural trope that mass killers, particularly in schools, are all kids that have been bullied, and they've been bullied terribly. That's really not true.
Interesting.
We've had bullying, unfortunately, throughout the history of humanity, and never before has bullying been used as an excuse to go out and kill people. I was certainly bullied in school. Most kids at some point have a bullying experience, but the story has never been, oh, you've been bullied, therefore the solution is to go in and kill a bunch of people. So this is a new script that's part of what I'm so concerned about, is that the more we talk about bullying as a reason, that we're actually teaching kids that this is an acceptable way to handle bullying.
Interesting. And it's putting, I mean, I obviously bullying can be traumatic and will absolutely shape many people's lives. I mean, from my own perspective, I think it shaped the course of my life, what clubs I joined, and those clubs, manifesting into other things. But if it's not that I don't want to recognize the effects of bullying, but if it's purely from a male victimhood perspective, that can come out in different ways too. So I immediately think of, and I don't want to say their names for many reasons, but the child who went into the school and mass shooting recently, a couple months ago, and turns out that the parents were cognizant and are now being held, being prosecuted by a female prosecutor, and I think like there was something about that story that cracked open a conversation about the relationship between the toxic masculinity that's being played out through young boys and the relationship to potentially the politics in the home and how it relates to guns and how they overlay. Is this something that's being studied enough?
Yeah, it really is. And one of my concerns and the motivations for writing the book is people think we don't know why this happens. Actually, if you're involved at all in forensic science, psychology from the point of view of why people commit crimes, there's tons of research on it. And the attitude toward guns, particularly in the home, has a tremendous amount to do with, number one, access. Kids who grow up with guns all over the house have a much greater tendency to use guns. Most school shooters use parents' guns. So when we talk about, all these illegal guns, that's really not the problem when it comes to these incidents. And when we talk about, bizarre, parents buying kids automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons of war as Christmas presents, this was the case with Sandy Hook. And that, young man who was really disturbed, he started shooting with his mother at age 3. And I guess he was a great shot at age 3.
Oh my God.
And so, yes, guns in the home and parental attitude toward the acceptability of kids using guns. Now, of course, there are, the majority of families who go hunting or whatever, that's not the case. But when you combine all these other factors with the parental support and accessibility of guns, it's certainly one important aspect.
Well, what's interesting about that, what you just told me, is there are a lot of folks, and I kind of want to use that 5-year mark as an important factor here, because you said in the last 5 years it's gotten much worse, as has right-wing extremism and right-wing terrorist organizations that have just ballooned. But I want to, prior to 5 years ago, say 2016, and probably prior to, if we want to really go back, 2008 or beyond, you'd hear NRA members say, listen, it's about responsible gun ownership. We're not opposed. and members, I'm not saying the leadership. Many NRA members would say, I am all for sound gun laws. It makes sense to be able to have a registry, to make sure that people know how to use these guns. And I always felt like that was a more reasonable approach, given just the proliferation of gun use and around the country, and seeing how many just other shootings have occurred with guns that were sold in the black market, or at these these sales that they have in Arizona or Texas where like there's no registration. It's just
Right.
crazy to me. With that being said, though, someone like that kid at Sandy Hook who was taught how to use a gun responsibly, that's mechanical. That is not emotional.
Mm-hmm.
If you might be taught by your parents how to use that gun responsibly, only for for hunting, only for target practice, or whatever it is for sport. But if you if you have the emotional conditions, if there's something happening emotionally with you, and you have that tool that you do know how to use, isn't that just as dangerous?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is, and I think it's kind of a myth, that I mean, it's not completely a myth, because yes, there are families that you'd say are fairly psychologically healthy that believe in hunting. I'm not one of those people, but there are people who you would not say have aberrant personality qualities, who use guns and do have psychologically normal kids, who don't have these personality factors that are the risk factors. But I think most people who have guns believe that they're using them responsibly,
Right.
and that their kids would never do this. And in fact, often what people tell themselves and what they actually may believe is not really what's going on.
Interesting. So, how much does the U.S. government understand this? Does it seem like they're getting it or doing anything about this?
Well, the FBI gets it. The Secret Service gets it. There's tons of great information from the FBI and the Secret Service. And a lot of that is what I used as, resource material for the book.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a government that doesn't work very well. And
Really?
when it comes to the legislators and the people who make laws, they're incredibly influenced by the pro-gun lobby. And are they getting it? No, they're the ones saying, oh, we solved this by arming teachers. Well, are we going to arm yoga studio
Yeah.
teachers? Are we going to arm retail clerks in malls? Are we going to arm the waiters in restaurants, which is where all these incidents are increasingly happening? Are we going to have armed guards in every synagogue or every mosque, or even, certain Christian churches? Which have also been targeted. So the idea that more guns are going to make us safer is absurd, but we have lots of politicians who are promoting that idea. So yeah, even though there are government agencies who understand this and understand it well, nobody's working together.
And then simultaneously attacking the other issues of right-wing extremism, which potentially gets passed down to the young children. Also the internet exposure, as you said, there are these
Yes.
communities that are popping up and echo chambers that, of course,
Yep.
facilitate this. Is that being dealt with?
Yeah, I don't think we're dealing with the internet well at all. And that, I think, when we look at what's been happening in the last 5 years, it is internet based. And a lot of it is racial hatred, but there's
Mhm.
also gender hatred. So
Yeah.
you've got the incel, the involuntary celibate movement. There have been some horrendous mass killings committed by incels. And this is entirely generated online, where violence against women torture against women is celebrated. And when you have people with certain personality problems and certain mental health vulnerabilities, and they all connect online, and then you have a gamification factor
Right.
where people try to outdo each other.
Oh my God.
And this is, I think, what's fueling the increase that we're seeing currently.
And not to mention the tech companies, which are not doing anything to crack down on the algorithmic incentive structure to push.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We know. We're a
Yeah.
female-led show on the internet. It's funny. No, but it's also dangerous. I'm glad that you bring this up, because we say this over and over and over on our show that at least in the world that we're in, the algorithm is very much built by white men maybe not with the motivation or incentive, the intention, I should say, of creating these spaces, but it happens because of their perspective. And then obviously when you see political YouTube shows, I think there's like 2 or 3 that are hosted by women, only women, and this ecosystem becomes very much reflective, and then it goes into other, you have a conversation online, and if it's majority male led and they're getting all the views and they're getting supported by the algorithm, and then those conversations spill over into Twitter and into Reddit, into other communities, and so it's just sort of this cycle. But I can't even imagine how that plays out in the darker aspects of the web, and where it starts.
And to the point of, there have been multiple incidents of people live streaming, on Facebook, and other platforms. I have a practice in Oregon and California, and there have been multiple incidents, and then the horrible New Zealand killing, which was all live streamed. And so this performative aspect of it is another internet enabled tendency.
The other side of this is sometimes we hear that they just want attention, and I didn't say the person's name because I've as a news presenter, I've been advised to stay away from that. Is it as much about that, or how much of it is attention?
Fame is a massive motivating factor, massive. And this has been identified by the FBI and Secret Service for a long time. The Columbine guys were joking on some of their self-made videos about which directors would be doing the story of their lives and how famous they would be forever. And unfortunately, a lot of that has proven to be true.
Michael Moore, guys.
Michael Moore did the movie, and it was supposed to be an anti-gun movie, but in truth, the movie has been glorified and used by many of the mass killers as sort of a model. Let's try and do what they did because they're so cool. There are still active Reddit groups based around this sort of hero worship of the Columbine guys, all these years later. So the fame is a big quality. Narcissism is one of the personality traits, along with a few others, that you tend to see that just show up over and over again, even in the younger kids who do this. And so the tendency to, well, if I'm not really significant in anything in my real life, my daily life, I will be really important and I will be powerful and feared. And there's the sense of, I'm going to have godlike power because I get to decide who dies here, which is a really twisted perception of the world. But we're not talking about happy, well-adjusted people here. So even though they may externally not really show the perceptual distortions that are going on in their thoughts.
Okay, so you're a psychotherapist. You're qualified to answer this question. How much of narcissism is I don't want to say biological, but is it, how much are folks being raised to be narcissists? Or modeled? Like, because I see this as white supremacy, and I see white supremacy as like tremendous narcissism.
Yeah, very much, very much. And there's a lot of new research, again, about how to be an influencer on the internet and how this impacts young kids who grow up. The whole YouTube thing, I know because I see children as well as adults in my practice, and there are 4-year-olds who have unrestricted access to YouTube and are little girls that are doing makeup tutorials. And it's like, okay, there's a place for things, but not with little kids. And I do think that narcissism is increasing we've measured that in multiple ways. And in many cases, it's benign, but certainly not always. And when you combine it with paranoia and psychopathy, the clinical term for the psychopath, and a bit of sadism, you've got the recipe for a very dangerous person.
If you're it's one thing if you're on the internet and you're seeing these things at a young age, but simultaneously, if you are living in a home that sort of may have reflections of that too, whether it's
very much,
right-wing tendencies, needing a gun because like white America, whatever their mindset is, like who's coming to get them. So how do you think we could solve these problems? I mean, we're talking about the internet in particular, and I immediately think about in 2010 or so or 11 when ISIS started to grow very, very fast, and a lot of it was being facilitated. The discussions were being facilitated online. It was a decentralized organization. It wasn't like Al Qaeda, and
Mhm.
and President Obama immediately went to the tech companies and the FBI and they said, we got to do something about with the communities online in which they're organizing, and they did. Did it solve it? There's other aspects too, but is that is that a solution? Are there other solutions? We have free speech in this
Yeah.
country.
Yeah, there are so many factors that go into it, and that's like the really long final chapter of my book is all the different ways we can go at this, because if it was as simple as, oh well, just ban violent video games and it will all stop, again, that would have been great. Unfortunately, that is not going to have any impact whatsoever. So deplatforming, I think, of hate groups, particularly ones that are advocating violence,
Mm-hmm.
I think is super important. 8chan was an image board that was incredibly popular, millions and millions of users of 8chan. And that went away after several mass shootings in 2019, 2020, because they had a huge community who were promoting and gamifying mass shooters. And many of the mass shooters had announced on 8chan their plans in advance or had posted links to video of their crime. And in fact, the founder of 8chan, a guy named Fred Brennan, who had originally been just a complete advocate of uncensored internet and we've got to allow free speech no matter what. And then it ended up being a kiddie porn haven and a haven for mass killers. And so he then did an about face and said, I'm pulling out of this. He became a very vocal opponent of it. Someone else was running it at that time, but they were soon deplatformed and went away.
Wow.
And I think that's a good thing. Now, does that mean that it hasn't moved to other places? I'm sure it has. But 8chan was big and it was known, in that way. And so the fact that it was deplatformed is good. And I think, again, one of the things the FBI is supposedly working on is getting more involved in the dark web and understanding more the dangers. And, if you're advocating the commission of genocide, it's really hard to, I think, justify that under free speech. So we're still exploring and finding this. One of my key points is that if we can interrupt more upstream rather than downstream, long before anybody picks up a gun,
that's right,
we're doing a much better job. And so the more we can get mental health therapists embedded in schools who can notice kids, the kids may not be mentally ill per se with a major mental illness, but you can certainly notice antisocial tendency. I have a lot of friends who are teachers who are clients. And, the thing I hear consistently from them is, I am overwhelmed. I am overworked. I see really troubled kids and I have no resources. I have no way to help them. And I think, teachers are angels. They deserve accolades and they're doing their best, but we're failing them. We're failing them. So we need more mental health resources in the schools. We need more in the communities. Some school districts are doing a great job, but most are not. The majority are not funded to do this. And
well,
so
schools aren't funded, and maybe the ones that are doing better, which are funded because of tax dollars, are also in communities where there may not be as much economic tension, which of course is an added element to stress at home, et cetera, et cetera. Parents not being around because they're working, everybody knows what it's like to be an American.
Exactly. Yeah. And so those are all important things. I think helping people understand what the red flags are, particularly with these guys that go into the workplace and kill a bunch of people, or newspapers. There was the staff, I think it was the Washington Gazette, where a guy went in, people, it's called leakage. People talk about these things that they're going to do. And often they talk about it for years in advance. They'll make threats. They make very overt threats, often making posts on social media. But people don't realize, I need to report this.
Mm-hmm.
They'll say, oh, well, he's always been kind of an angry guy. He doesn't mean it, or he's just joking. And, most of the time people don't follow through. But when you see a pattern of ideation, you need to reach out, and find a mental health therapist who has some experience in this. The person is likely not going to go, but family members can go, and can consult with a therapist about, I'm seeing these signs in my husband or my brother. I'm really kind of nervous about the things he's been posting online. And, if you don't feel like we're getting some resolution that way, then you need to contact law enforcement. So adding more, particularly in schools, this is a new thing we're recommending, adding anonymous tip lines, because kids are understandably really reluctant to, narc on their friends or their siblings. But most of the time there's leakage in advance. And if we can intervene before it gets too far, training law enforcement, another concern is that guys have posted things online. They've made threats. Some have even put up YouTube videos about what their plans are. And a person has made a report to law enforcement. The cops have gone out, had a little talk at the front door, but they don't ever go and look at what's available. Getting crisis teams in schools. So let's say something comes into a tip line, a crisis team that involves someone from law enforcement, a mental health therapist, and a person that works in the school. They get together with that kid, find out, do they have access to weapons? What's the support like in the home? How serious are they? Do they have a history of violence? And so we can just do a much better job in so many areas, and hopefully then never get into, oh, this very unstable, angry kid went out and just bought the AR-15.
I want to end with one aspect, and that's the pandemic. I mean, we've been dealing with a very stressful last 2 years. Simultaneously, kids have not been socializing in the same ways and been online. They're already online a lot. They've been online even more, with homeschooling. And obviously, where do they fill their time when they can't go play with their friends? Do we see, I mean, obviously folks haven't been in school, but are we seeing more of a rise in these organized hate groups online in the last 2 years?
Yeah. I don't know how much data we have yet about it, but certainly what I hear anecdotally from people in law enforcement and other clinicians is that there's a lot more time spent online. And yes, increasingly people do work their way into hate groups as a way to deal with their boredom and their lack of a sense of competency. They find a group, a sense of camaraderie and friendship. And unfortunately, it's often in very dark places.
And there's pipelines, of course, which we talk a lot about on the show. Is there's certain pipelines that lead to this. I'm really fascinating conversation. I urge everybody to go check out. The book is titled The Minds of Mass Killers, Understanding and Interrupting the Pathway to Violence, important aspect. Shavaun Scott, thank you so much for writing this, taking the time, really identifying what a lot of these red flags are so folks know, because of course, we can't just rely on government to come in and save us.
No. And there is, one of the myths is two myths. It's senseless. It's not. It makes sense when you understand how these folks think. And there's nothing we can do is another myth. We can do so much. We just have to understand the problem. So that's my passion. I think we can do better.
You're doing the work. Thank you so much, Shavaun Scott. Really appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
If you aren't already, join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show and become a patron. That's how we do this. It's really important to support independent media.